was a busy couple of weeks in the sporting calendar as several sports saw their seasons come to a dramatic end. The Edmonton Oilers had already won their first NHL League title this year, and followed it up by winning the Stanley Cup against the previous year's winners, the New York Islanders. The Oilers would go on to great success in the 1980s, winning the Stanley Cup 4 more times, inspired by their young stars Wayne Gretzky, Mark Messier and Jari Kurri, with goaltender Grant Fuhr becoming the first black player to lift the trophy. Meanwhile, Liverpool followed up their league title by defeating AS Roma on penalties in Rome to win the European Cup, forerunner of the modern Champions League, for the 4th time. Liverpool had also won the League Cup, and with the FA Cup won by Everton, all 4 pieces of major silverware available to English football clubs headed to Merseyside. And the British Home Championship, an annual football competition between England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, previously Ireland, finished its centennial and last edition with a 1-1 draw between Scotland and England in Glasgow, which allowed Northern Ireland to claim the title. 2 editions of the championship had been cancelled earlier in the 80s due to hooliganism, while the teams were finding the increasing number of international fixtures meant that the home championship was becoming a burden. Elsewhere in Britain, the miners' strike ground on, with the coking plant at Orgreave in South Yorkshire becoming a focus of increasing tensions, as the unions bussed in so-called flying pickets from other areas to prevent it receiving coal supplies, and the police likewise brought in support from other forces around the country. And the F1 teams arrived in Monaco for race 6 in the season, and with Teo Fabi off in Milwaukee racing IndyCars for Dick Forsyth, his brother Corrado would make his Brabham debut. Otherwise, all was as it had been in France, except that Martin Brundle's Tyrrell was now adorned with a fetching shade of wine red thanks to sponsorship from Yardley Gold. Beloff's remained in his black, red and gold Moredo colours. Sadly, Yardley wouldn't get their money's worth at this race at least, because Martin had a huge shunt at Tabac on Saturday when pushing hard to make the grid.
I don't think there was a problem with the car. I think I just arrived too quickly, was committed to the corner, and there was nothing. There's no room around here to manoeuvre.
Now, they had trouble getting you out of the car. Can you remember that?
Very vaguely. I can remember 2 or 3 guys around me tugging away at my helmet. I remember pushing them away, I think, because they were I've got a bit of a sore neck, as you can imagine, and I didn't want 3 people tugging at my crash helmet. But I was only semi-conscious. The next thing I remember, the crowd, the crowd cheered, and the next thing I was in the pits. I must have run back to the pits. I don't know how or where or how I got into the pits. And I do just recall Ken saying, did I want to go in the spare car? And I said, yes, of course I did. And then obviously that was, I don't remember much after that.
Depending on who you believe, he was either asked by Sid Watkins how he'd got back to the pits and couldn't remember, or he got in the spare car and then asked Ken Tyrrell which track they were at and which way to turn out of the pit lane. In either case, the clearly concussed Martin was hors de combat for the rest of the session and hadn't set a good enough time, so would, probably for the best, be having Sunday off. With just 20 grid slots available at Monaco and the extreme difficulty of passing on the track, qualifying is always fiercely fought in the Principality, and it was Prost who eventually triumphed, taking his first pole of the year and the first for the new McLaren MP4 too. Alongside him was Nigel Mansell, making his first front row start, with the Ferraris and Renaults on rows 2 and 3 respectively. Prost's teammate Lauda was back in 8th, just behind an excellent De Cesaris, full fire extinguisher this time, and ahead of Piquet and Rosberg way back on row 5. Corrado Fabi put his Brabham 15th, and Beloff just squeaked onto the grid 20th in the other Tyrrell, just beating Mark Seurer, who'd opted to take the Ford-powered Arrows again as he felt more comfortable in it than in the new car, which didn't qualify either. Perhaps the biggest surprise DNQ was Eddie Cheever in the Alfa, who just couldn't find a clear lap, while Piercarlo Gonzani might have been pleasantly surprised to be starting. Race day dawned, and it was not a pretty sight. Rain lashed the city, the tallest buildings disappearing into the lowest clouds. It rained all morning, it rained over lunch, and it was still teeming down when the cars came out to form up on the grid. Mansell decided to use the old trick of going out, coming into the pit lane and driving straight through, then going round again, before lining up on the grid to give himself an extra lap's practice in the conditions. The start was actually delayed by 45 minutes because, ironically, it was too dry in the tunnel. Niki Lauda, in his capacity as head of the Grand Prix Drivers Association, pointed out to Bernie, with his folk hat on, that it was dangerous to go from wet to wet again so quickly, especially as the tunnel had been heavily oiled by the previous day's vintage car race, so Eccleston arranged for the fire service to hose the tunnel down. Once that was sorted, they set off for the parade lap, Even at low speed, great rooster tails of spray were being thrown up by the cars, and whoever got out of Saint-Devote in the lead would have an even bigger advantage than usual at Monaco, in that they would actually be able to see where they were going. Nobody was expecting the race to run the full 76 laps, but rather to the 2-hour limit. The cars lined up on the sodden grid, and away they went, scrambling down into Saint-Devote as the cars disappeared in a grey wall of spray. Prost made it through in the lead with Mansell behind, but lost in the spray and the bad atmospheric conditions for broadcast. Warwick got a good start and tried to sneak into third ahead of Arnoux, only to be nudged into the tyre barrier, where he was promptly hit by Tombe, with De Angelis and Patrese both screeching to a halt to avoid hitting the tangled Renaults and having to stop and go round, dropping both to the back of the field. Warwick hopped out and limped away, having now badly bruised his left leg to match the ones on his right leg from Dijon. Tombe, however, was in more trouble and had to be lifted from his car and stretchered off with a broken leg. While all this was being sorted out, Prost continued to lead, with Mansell still hard on his heels, followed at a slight distance by the Ferraris, with Lauda and Rosberg now 5th and 6th. De Cesaris was also out on lap 1, while Cecotto only made it round once more before spinning his Tolman into retirement too. Slowly Prost began to pull away from Mansell, while Lauda had caught up to the back of Alboreto, and Rosberg already had a misfire in his Honda engine and was dropping back towards Winkelhock, and Senna was also coming up well in 8th, but not as well as Stefan Bellof, who'd made it up from 20th to 10th in the first few laps. Lauda barged past Alboreto on the Lowe's hairpin on lap 3 and was soon up behind Arnoux, and went past at the start of lap 6. For a driver who'd historically not really enjoyed driving in the wet, he wasn't doing too badly at all. Meanwhile, Mansell had closed back up on Prost, setting fastest lap in the process, and as the McLaren came past the pits, a slight misfire in his tag engine was audible. Hainaut knocked his nose off, then had a moment at Saint-Devote, his first experience of F1 in the wet proving a slippery one, and a short one, with electrical troubles sending him out on lap 13. Alboreto also had a spin, but kept the engine running, dropping back down the order as he argued with the officials who wanted to stop him re-entering. That promoted Rosberg to 5th, and now he had a charging Senna right on his gearbox, or as close as he could get in the conditions, and Winkelhock behind them had Stefan Bellof's Tyrrell bearing down on them. On lap 10, Senna got a bit too close, couldn't see, and whacked a curb, which deranged his front suspension a little, but it didn't seem to slow him down at all, while Corrado Fabi's Brabham debut ended with more electrical woes. And then, while the cameras were watching the Rosberg-Senna duel, Prost fumbled while lapping Alboreto, and Mansell surged past to lead a Grand Prix for the first time at the 49th time of asking. Almost as soon as the director cut away to Mansell, now lapping Patrese, Senna also got past Rosberg and began closing on Arnoux, quickly passing the Ferrari. Nigel led confidently for 6 laps, until he put a tyre on a slippery road marking and careened sideways into the barriers. He kept it running, but had damaged his rear wing and suspension. He went on for a couple more corners. Then, as Prost came back through, he spun out at Mirabeau. About the same time, Piquet disappeared from what had been a rather anonymous race. So now Prost led Lauda, with Senna 3rd and right on the Austrian's tail. Arnoux 4th, Rosberg 5th, and Bellof 6th. The young Brazilian had already proved to be equal to the challenge of veterans Rosberg and Arnoux, and now he simply pulled out and went round the outside, going into Saint-Devote, and went 2nd. Prost, with a 24-second lead on lap 20, now had to worry about his lead, with his engine misfiring slightly and his brakes also beginning to give problems. Behind Lauda there was a 3-way scrap between Arnoux, Rosberg and Bellof, and the German driver was all over the back of Rosberg, making the most of the superior response of his atmospheric engine in conditions where having a bit less raw power was actually a bit of an advantage. As Rosberg braked for the Nouvelle Chicane out of the tunnel, Bellof braked just that little bit later and was through. They all moved up another place when Lauda made an uncharacteristic error in Casino Square on lap 23 and spun, stalling his engine and parking it, so Prost was in the lead with Senna 2nd and still gaining, then Arnoux, who now had Bellof on his tail and trying hard to get past. As they came round into Mirabeau on lap 27, Bellof made a move, Arnoux squeezed him over, but Bellof held his line and moved up to 3rd. Prost, meanwhile, was still being caught by Senna, now taking lumps out of his lead to the tune of 3 seconds a lap. And with the race not even at half distance or half time, it was beginning to look like young Senna might even manage a win in just his 6th race, unless Bellof caught them both. By now, the rain had intensified into an absolute downpour, and as Prost came through at the end of lap 30, he was waving his arms at the officials. Alain had slowed right down, allowing a lapped Alboreto to close right up, and Senna had the gap down to just 7 seconds as he came through. On lap 31, Prost waved his arms again, and this time, clerk of the course Jackie Ickx, himself a Formula F1 driver of considerable experience who'd finished second in similar conditions in 1972, apparently agreed, and out went the red flags. Prost completed lap 32, slowing right up on the line to pull over by the checkered and red flags, and Senna blasted through, crossing the line in first place. But it wouldn't stand. To Ayrton's disappointment, Ickx ruled that the positions were taken at the end of the last completed lap by every driver, which was the previous lap, and Prost had his 12th win, albeit only for half points. Senna had every reason to be proud of his second place, as had Stefan Bellof, who came home third. Arnoux, Rosberg and De Angelis picked up the remaining points, with Alboreto, Ghinzani his best ever finish in 8th, and Lafitte the remaining runners. So McLaren had won 5 out of the 6 races so far this year. Senna joined Prost for the informal prize-giving, nothing so formal as a podium ceremony in Monaco, and looked rather glum, having been under the impression that he won until he got out of his car and had the situation explained to him. Bellof elected to go and dry off instead, possibly still annoyed at the race having been cut short when he might have felt he could also have won. He was gaining on both Senna and Prost at the time. In the days following the race, both Senna and Bellof expressed their dissatisfaction with the way the race had been cancelled. Not necessarily the decision to do so, but the timing of it, seemingly done so to ensure Prost would win. Even Jean-Marie Balestre, head of FISA, expressed doubts that Ickx was a fit person to be making that decision, given he was also driving for Porsche in endurance racing, and thus potentially biased in favour of the Porsche-powered Prost. Ickx, in return, announced that he would sue Balestre for libel, and pointed out that FISA had no objection to him being clerk of the course at Monaco until then. It was in the end a rather acrimonious end to what should have been a great day, with 2 rookie drivers second and third, and announcing their considerable talents to the world at large. Nigel Mansell, meanwhile, hadn't done himself any favours in the eyes of his sceptical boss Peter Waugh, and many were looking askance at Renault and wondering how a low-speed crash like that had demolished both chassis and injured both drivers. There was certainly plenty to talk about as the teams packed their bags for the 3-race North American Tour, beginning in Montreal in 2 weeks' time.